65-year-old male back pain, 211 Silver Hollow Road, between Lane Road and Cross. 65-year-old male back pain, 211.
I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to the USA Watchdog YouTube channel. It supports USAWatchdog.com. I'm a former investigative correspondent. I worked on ABC's Good Morning America and also on CNN on many of their platforms. I try to put out interviews and information that is above all accurate. As my slogan on the website says, I try to give you a clear picture of what's really going on. I hope you enjoy the channel, and I hope you subscribe. Thanks again. I'm Greg Hunter.
Good evening. This is Peter Helland with Dr. E. Michael Jones. I think, Mike, it's been quite a while since you've been back on. A lot has happened. We're choosing to point out that you finished a book in between the last time, and it has many pages. And if I could we can jump into the theme of the book and then see where it corresponds to some of the themes of the show. I think we quoted from the book of Titus a lot, and I think that there's a lot of themes in Scripture. Obviously, you're given the position of kind of resourcing the Catholic Church somewhat, authors in that, to track this book, The History of Capitalism. But let's look at these scriptures here, and I don't know if they'd be helpful, if they'd be of help to help us understand how this book would be important to Christians. In Titus it says, for there are many, in chapter 1, for there are many unruly, vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. Goes on and says, wherefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men that turn from the truth. And then it closes in that chapter and says, they profess that they know God, but in works they deny him. I'm kind of asking you to see, if, as you talk about this book, is there something that your book does address that's relevant to a Christian as they read the scriptures and as they...
Well, if you're talking about that particular passage, this book it's a history of capitalism, but it's also a sequel to my book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit.
Right, and you said at one time it's the flip side of the same coin.
It's the flip side of that coin. So the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, to recapitulate, talks about the Jewish Revolutionary and how that began with the Jews confronting their Messiah. The Messiah comes to save the lost children of the house of Israel, and they have to make up their mind whether they're going to accept Jesus Christ or reject him. So the Jews who accept him became known as the Catholic Church. These are the people, the direct line of history, from Abraham to Moses to Jesus Christ to the church. That's the direct line of history, which makes it confusing because we still have Jews around, and the Jews are the people who rejected Jesus Christ. And we talked about this before on your program, and when the Jews rejected Jesus Christ, they became revolutionaries, because they rejected not only Christ, but Christ as the Logos, which is to say reason or order. The order of the universe as a manifestation of God's mind is what they rejected. Well, when you do that, you're a revolutionary. And so since that time, they've become this permanent body. I think this is what St. Paul is adverting to there. This permanent revolutionary body is always spreading kind of dissenting ideas, subverting the morals of the Christian population, coming up with crazy theories that everybody thinks are great for about 5 years, and then suddenly everybody realizes they're stupid. That's the type of thing we're talking about.
A lot of people are revolutionaries, but what's unique about the Jewish revolutionary spirit is that the one thing that holds them together is their rejection of Christ.
Right.
Whereas the Hell's Angels don't define themselves by the common denominator is that they reject Christ. Because if a Jew does accept Christ, then they're kicked out of the synagogue. I mean, they're no longer considered a
Right.
Jew, where they can become a Buddhist or an atheist.
Right. Yes.
So that makes them.
But I think what you see is, yes, there are all kinds of revolutionary groups out there. But I think what you see over the course of history, and that's why I pointed out in my book, is that these revolutionary groups invariably tend to take on Jewish characteristics. So the prime example from an American perspective would be the Puritans, okay, who were revolutionaries in England, decapitated the king, came over here, and then created a kind of revolutionary society over here, based on mammon, devoting themselves to mammon. This is what Karl Marx said in So Judenfrage, which led to a revolution in this country. And the Yankees were the revolutionary ferment, and then that led to a civil war and another revolution.
But they also had a theology that elevated the Jews. In other words, the Puritan hope was that Christ would come back at the same time, corresponding to a time period where the Jews would be converted back to their land,
Right.
converted, and their hope was fully set on a revival that would occur at this time. And a lot of people think Cotton Mather himself, so that's a crazy idea, but
Right.
it's
Even though his father articulated that crazy idea. That side of the story, that's the revolutionary side of the story. But there's another side of the story. And that's told by, in many ways, one of these Jewish revolutionaries, Karl Marx, who wasn't a Jew. I mean, his father had converted to Christianity, but he was the grandson of a rabbi from Germany, from Trier, coming from an ancient line of rabbis, and imbibed the Jewish revolutionary spirit and gave it a new form known as communism. And he understood the other side of the coin very well, because he said in his essay called On the Jewish Question, or Zur Judenfrage, he said the Jewish God is money. Jewish God is money.
well, the South said that about all Northerners.
Well, that's because there is one of the most potent gods out there is money, or mammon, as we say in the Bible. So what you see here are basically two parallel tracks. And so how can I symbolize this relationship? Balzac is walking through the streets of Paris in the 1830s, and there he sees Heinrich Heine and James Rothschild walking arm in arm through the streets of Paris. Now, from a Marxian perspective, if you're going to say that a revolution is based on class conflict, this makes no sense whatsoever. The richest man in Europe walking arm in arm with the premier Jewish revolutionary from Germany. That doesn't make any sense from a Marxian point of view, but it does make sense from an ethnic point of view, because they're both Jews, and they both sense this. What do they have in common? They have this sense of hatred toward Christian culture, and they're both working. So what you find after a while is that both capitalism and communism are both working to destroy Christian culture wherever they find it. So a later manifestation of the same thing would be Jacob Schiff and Trotsky. Jacob Schiff, one of the richest Jews in New York City, and Trotsky, one of the most famous Jewish revolutionaries, collaborate. Schiff gives Trotsky money, Trotsky rents a ship, and got all these revolutionaries, they sail to Russia. Why are they going to attack Russia? Well, because it's the only Christian country left in Europe. So you take the two books together, and so the Jewish revolutionary spirit is about Heine and Trotsky, and Baron Metal is about the Rothschild family, for example.
And Schiff.
And Schiff, and Lloyd Blankfein. And Lloyd Blankfein, to give you a recent example, is chairman of Goldman Sachs, which is a Jewish firm, and he supports gay marriage. So once again, you have this Jewish penchant here of the rich supporting the revolution, and as a result, destroying the social order. But we don't want to just destroy the social order. What they want to do is create a new social order, a Jewish social order, in which the Jews are in control, and the main way the Jew stays in control is through usury.
And just Goldman Sachs, I was at the Heritage Foundation meeting in Atlanta, and a lot of people were really wanting Ted Cruz to be their top choice for president. But they also said, if you're going to vet a politician, you need to find out the spouse and who the spouse works for. And I brought up, well, Ted Cruz's wife is a vice president for Goldman Sachs.
And what did the Heritage people say to that? Next question. Next question.
Right, because the spouse and who she works for, they were saying, can determine a lot about what that politician's going to do.
Sure.
The spouse and who she works for, they were saying, can determine a lot about what that politician's going to do.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, we could go down that road as well. But what I'm trying to say here is that we're dealing with two fundamentally different views of the economy, because we're dealing with two fundamentally different views of human nature, of man. And the two fundamentally different views are epitomized by the two alternatives for economies throughout the world. It's not capitalism versus communism, it's labor versus usury.
Now, when you say the word economy, do you need to define how you define the word economy?
The economy is all of the people in a nation. Let's define it the way Pesch would, as the function of a nation state. The people engaging in exchange of goods and services in the nation. All those people taken together make up the economy of the nation. All those people working, exchanging, making deals, and so on and so forth for throughout the nation.
Okay.
The combination of all those interactions is called the economy.
Okay. And so, like for example, you were talking about the living wage.
So basically, as I said, we have two choices in this world. And the two choices are to base the economy on labor or to base it on usury. And so the ancient world, to begin with, was based on slavery. Aristotle could not conceive of a world without slavery. He could not conceive of a philosopher without slavery, a slave doing all the manual labor that would allow him the leisure to philosophize.
Well, he may be correct. I mean, we call people that have these jobs out here, we say they're not slaves, but
we are heading, as you're correct in saying, we are heading back to the slavery of the Roman Empire. So slavery was one aspect of the Roman Empire, the other aspect is usury. And these two things go hand in hand because usury creates slavery. And the magic formula that does this is known as compound interest. And compound interest is it's such a magical thing. They once asked Einstein, if you had to come up with one idea, what do you think is the most brilliant idea you could come up with? And he said compound interest. Because if you're on the right side of compound interest, in other words, if you're a creditor, the money just pours into your pocket and you don't have to do anything. If you're on the wrong side of compound interest, which is to say if you're a debtor, well then you can do whatever you want and you're going to fall behind. Because nothing in this world can keep up with the inexorable nature of compound interest. So you put this together in an empire like the Roman Empire, which basically acquired wealth from plunder, wealth in the form of gold, plundering other countries, bringing the gold back to Rome. That gold ended up into the hands of wealthy people who would then lend it out at interest. And as a result, everyone in the Roman Empire, the overwhelming majority, started to fall into debt slavery. And so the Germanic, the warring barbaric Germanic tribes would come down, they crossed the Danube, they crossed the Rhine, they took over the Roman Empire, and they set up their kingdom. And what's a German love to do? He loves to chase pigs through the forest. So the Lombards set up and they started chasing pigs through the forest. And it would have remained that way forever, except for the fact that the Benedictines taught them how to engage in agriculture. So you're talking about the Christianization of these barbaric Germanic tribes over this period of time. When things got tough, when the Vikings showed up, or the Saracens, you could pull inside the monastery, kind of pull up the gates and wait out the siege and hope they'd go away. And then you go out and you start doing the stuff all over again. Over a certain period of time, this finally took root. The Germans decided to give up chasing pigs through the forest. They decided to raise pigs instead and have farms and so on and so forth. And as a result of this concentration of human labor, what results when you concentrate human labor? Wealth. Wealth started to arise in Europe. And it arose first in the city-states of Italy, because they were the most suited for this development at this particular time. So they got involved in manufacturing. And specifically, they got involved in the manufacturing that, in effect, created Europe, which was cloth manufacturing. And the Medici were a family who got involved in cloth manufacturing, so they made wool. And all of the economic developments that we have at the beginning of capitalism came from Italy and the problems that they had with the wool business. So, for example, one of the biggest markets, first of all, Italy does not have enough sheep to produce the wool, the cloth they need for their markets.
So their markets were outside of Italy too, right?
It was all Europe.
Yeah.
It was basically all of Europe. And all of Europe, in a sense, was involved in the production of wool, and it was different kinds of wool depending on where it came from. So because the sheep were different, like the wool in the Danube Valley was tended to be more water resistant, and so it was good for outside garments. And the wool from someplace else was good. It took a really good black color, so the clerics used that a lot, and so on and so forth. But Italy was always the top of the market. It was the top end of the market. So they had to get their wool from England, and okay, that's traveling by ship. Okay, that's annoying to begin with. They had to sell it in northern Europe, in a place like a city like Brugge, which is now in Belgium. And at the beginning, when you had economic exchange, basically money was little pieces of gold or silver. And so what you had to do was carry bags of gold to a place where the buyers and sellers came together. Well, this is always a bad idea because someone can rob you along the way, and that's it. So in order to forestall that, you had to have knights, in other words, bodyguards. But in order to have the bodyguards, you got to pay the bodyguards, and then when they get there, they're always causing trouble. So you create this, like tournaments, where they joust to keep themselves from killing each other while the people are doing business. Well, it's a bad idea, and it would not sustain the commerce that was needed. So eventually, the Italians in Italy started dealing with their branch firms in Brugge by just saying, okay, I'll ship you this, it will cost this much, and you ship me that, and that will cost that much. And instead of sending gold back and forth, I'll just make an entry here, and you make an entry there. And so this was the beginning of double entry bookkeeping, which obviated the need for carrying pieces of metal around Europe with you. And so it was tending toward paper in that regard. So at this point, you have the beginning of the money economy. prosperity in Europe. And at this point, because we have a money economy, people need money. That makes sense. The problem is that up until this point, you've got an economy for the average guy, the serf, that is based not on money, but on labor. In other words, you owe the Lord 3 days a week. And if you do that, then your obligation is fulfilled. Well, at this point, the Lord doesn't want 3 days a week. He wants money because he's got to buy things. And so, how do you get the money? Where's the money going to come from? Well, you've got to borrow it. Well, it's immoral to lend money. So who's going to do it? Well, the Jews are going to do it. And so the Jews would be brought in first to lend money to the prince, and then they could set up small-end, low-end payday loan operations like Quicken or whatever it is now. And that would allow that the Jew would lend you money. And it was a pawn shop, basically. So if you're a farmer, you hock your plow, he gives you money to pay your taxes, and he charges you 43 1/3% interest. Some things never change. We're back to that. Unfortunately, if you're a farmer and your plow's in the pawn shop, you're in trouble. You can't earn any money. And so there's immediate problems. Immediate. In other words, we're talking about usury causing immediate problems, social unrest that would more often than not, throughout this period of time, lead to the expulsion of the Jews from any country. So the standard Jewish explanation is anti-Semitism. It's an awful thing. Every country they go, there's anti-Semitism. It just grows like your beard. You know what I mean? Unless you shave it every day, there's anti-Semitism going to take over. Well, it turns out that the real reason is Jewish behavior. As always, the reason people don't like Jews is because the way Jews behave. And in this instance, it's lending money, which caused huge amounts of animosity. So England expelled the Jews in 1290, and because basically the people rioted. And the people rioted, and the first thing they did was head toward the Jew's house to burn the records about how much money he owed. And the king, realizing it's going to be insurrection, just expels the Jews, reneges on his loans, and that's the story over and over and over again throughout Europe. During this period of time, the Catholic Church starts protesting. Specifically, the Dominicans, the new orders, the mendicant orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans start preaching against usury. For a century, they're preaching against usury. Okay? The princes don't like this.
This is like, what, 13th?
Well, the beginning of the city would be the 13th century. By the 13th century, you have cities like Paris and all the city-states. By the 15th century, the 1400s, it's intense. This is getting intense. So we're talking about 2 centuries of preaching against usury. And the princes don't want to hear it because they get good rates from the Jews. This is what St. John Capistran was talking about. He would forever preach against the privileges of the Jews. What's he talking about? Well, the Jew comes in, the prince gets at 5%, and everybody else has to pay 43 1/3%, you know, or something like that. So they're unhappy, and so how are we going to deal with it? Well, the Medici, who were the papal bankers, the big banking family in Florence, take over the city in 1328. Cosimo becomes the whatever it is they call the guy there. It's not a king, it's a republic. First thing he does is bring the Jews in. This is in the aftermath of the first worker rebellion. At the end of the 14th century, the beginning of the money era, the serfs were being cheated out of their labor. They were being ground. They needed money, and so there was rebellions in England. It was Wat Tyler. In Florence, it was called the Ciompi Rebellion. Basically, a worker rebellion because they were being cheated. The money was being debased. They were being cheated out of their wages, and they wanted a better, more equitable system. The princes tricked them. The worker rebellions got nowhere, and then when Cosimo took over Florence, he indicated that he was not going to listen to their grievances by the fact that he brought the Jews in once again. They're always being expelled and brought back in. He brings them back in as a sign, we're not going to pay you a decent wage. This is always the infallible sign that you're not being paid a decent wage. Whether it's Florence in the end of the 14th century, whether it's the United States in the 1970s. What happened in America is the same thing that happened then. Wages stopped going up in the 1970s, and as soon as wages stopped going up, guess what arrives on the scene? Credit cards. And so credit cards take up the slack that wages, and they give the people the illusion that they still have money. When you don't, you're being cheated out of your wages, and the credit card is the proof that you're being cheated out of your wages. So this forestalls problems. But anytime you're dealing with usury, any solution, for any present solution is always paving the way for a disaster on the horizon because of compound interest. You can never keep up. No one can keep up with it. No one on the face of this earth. And so eventually the Medici family goes bust. The people are upset, and there's a revolution that takes place, largely because the King of France shows up. And the Medici leave, and a new dictator comes in, and his name is Savonarola, a famous Dominican. And this is a moment, it's one of those moments in history where things could have gone right, because Savonarola has a true sense of what Christian culture is all about. And what it's all about is charity. And the antithesis of charity in this instance is sodomy and usury. These are the twin ills of Florence and the twin ills in the United States right now. The more things change, the more they're the same. Sodomy and usury are the infallible sign that your culture is terminally corrupt.
And that was Dante's, in his famous book, The Inferno.
One of the few guys who got this right was Dante. When he wrote The Inferno, he put sodomites and usurers in the same circle in hell. Because the sodomite, because they're both unnatural. The sodomite takes what is fertile, namely sex, and makes it sterile through homosexual activity. And the usurer takes what is sterile, namely money, and makes it fertile through usury. So they're both bad. And so Savonarola brings about a reform, a huge reform of behavior, symbolized by the bonfire of the vanities, where people would throw their mirrors, and Botticelli threw a couple paintings on it and burned them up, and repentance is on the horizon. Problem is, depending on your point of view, the Pope is probably the most corrupt Pope in the history of the Church, Alexander VI, Borgia. And Savonarola doesn't like him, and the feeling is mutual, and Savonarola calls for the King of France to depose the Pope. Bad idea. Okay. Because the Pope is not going to put up with this, and so the Pope connives with the sodomites and the usurers in Florence, and they arrest Savonarola and they put him to death. And at this point, the moment of reform dies. Because not even all the gold in America can keep up with compound interest.
What is the, because people never think about it. I don't think people even think about compound interest and usury. People don't use the word usury.
No.
So it's so subtle that people just kind of...
You're not supposed to think about it. Decent people are only supposed to talk about gay marriage and go to football games. They're not supposed to talk about these things. And that's why we have gay marriage and football games, to distract people from their own economic interest and keep them stupid and poor, because that's the Jewish world that we live in right now.
But we are $18 trillion in debt ourselves, which is an impossible debt to recover from. I mean, and people still don't like to think about that.
That's not the significant debt. The significant debt is personal debt. I mean, it has a role to play, but the real significant debt is personal debt.
Each individual person.
Yeah, that's what really crushes you. That's what crushes the economy. Because eventually all you're doing is paying off your loans. You let it go long enough, you think, oh, I'll just do the minimum payment. Well, that just starts to snowball. And I'm saying the example is, if you think you can beat it, well, take a look at what happened to the Habsburgs.
Yeah, but
because eventually all you're doing is paying off your loans. You let it go long enough, you think, oh, I'll just do the minimum payment. Well, that just starts to snowball. And I'm saying the example is, if you think you can beat it, well, take a look at what happened to the Habsburgs.
Yeah, but why can't individuals overcome that? Don't they have the moral strength?
No, I'm sure, you have free will, and the answer to your question is, don't borrow money. That's simple, don't borrow money. But in a capitalist economy, you're forced to borrow money in all sorts of subtle ways. And the worst right now is student debt. These poor kids are being suckered into going $100,000, $200,000 in debt. Just the idea that they're going to get an education. This is a scandal. This is an outrage. And the fact that Notre Dame calls itself a Catholic college, has an $11 billion endowment, and still raises the price every year on the students is a scandal. This cries to heaven for vengeance. The fact I got a catalog, clothing catalog, comes in the mail. I'm looking at these prices are crazy. It's cheap junk. It's from China. It's not. This is wool, okay? That cheap junk. You can get a sweater for $14. Are you kidding me? That's a deflationary economy, which means that you've got a debt at premium numbers and you're paying it back on little deflated dollars. The best example of that is how many people are underwater now with their houses. This shows you the injustice of this thing. You bought a house for $100,000 on a 30-year mortgage, and you've been paying money, and you're 15 years into it. You've already paid twice the amount you borrowed, and now your house is only worth $50,000. This is outrageous. If the people weren't watching their damn football games and talking about gay marriage, they'd be out in the streets, which is why we have football games and television. In the Middle Ages, they knew what was going on. They started marching to where the Jew was living and burned his house down and burned his records, and they were out of debt. That's the way you canceled debt in the Middle Ages.
But is this like, you're going to be going to India in January, and you wrote the article about the rape crisis, and all of a sudden they're showing risque movies, and the Indian girls are not dressing modestly anymore, and the men can't control themselves.
Yes. Like explaining what is the real cause of the rape crisis. Well, it's capitalism. It's capitalism. But so we have a battle.
But you defined, I'm sorry to interrupt you, you did define capitalism in there as I was scanning it. You said it was Jewish business practices?
No, that's not what I said. It's state-sponsored usury.
Okay.
Capitalism is state-sponsored usury. And that's what it was in the United States. The creditor class created the United States in their interest. And they made laws. In a Catholic country, you cannot collect usurious debts because it's criminal. You can't enforce criminal behavior. And so this is the purpose, the new world of capitalism, which is basically now the state is going to insist that you pay off usurious debts. You know, and that's what capitalism is. So the creditors create the United States to their advantage, and it causes problems. 70 years you got unrepayable debt, and then it leads to massive war as the way out of unrepayable debt, and so on and so forth. So, you know, and that's what capitalism is. So the creditors create the United States to their advantage, and it causes problems. 70 years you got unrepayable debt, and then it leads to massive war as the way out of unrepayable debt, and so on and so forth. So you have this struggle. England conquers Spain, England defeats France, and then in the 19th century it's England versus Germany. By the end of the 19th century it's England versus Germany. Because Germany is the heir of the Holy Roman Empire, which is what the Benedictines created after the fall of Rome. And it's the only place on earth that still values labor. There was an article about Amazon and how terrible Amazon is to its employees in England and the United States, but it's not that bad in guess where? Germany. Because they still stand up for workers' rights there in a way that they do not do in English-speaking countries. So that leads to, you know, eventually the Germans are defeated. During this period of time, Germany had to come into existence as a country. It was a bunch of principalities that had been conquered by Napoleon, caused a lot of soul-searching, and eventually Germany, the reason I'm here, and the reason at least half of me is here, the reason half of you is here, is because the Germans did not provide decent, they were crushed by Napoleon and they weren't providing any opportunity for wages, earning a decent wage. Bishop von Kettler noticed this. He proposed reform. Bishop von Kettler is the founder of Catholic social teaching. He said the family is the unit of society. The criterion of a just wage is not how far down you can drive it. It's not a commodity like any other commodity that's a function of supply and demand. It is a function of the family, and so the criterion of a just wage is whether you can, a man by himself can support a wife and children on his salary. That is the objective criterion. If that's not it, your society is not just. Well, guess what really happened during this period of time? Just as we're talking about the 70s, what was the big dance craze in the 70s other than disco? It was called feminism. And what is the main tenet of feminism other than making a sacrament out of abortion? It is equal pay for equal work, which is code word for destroy the family.
Well, because, and
that's why I'm going to Indy. I can go back from the future to the present. I'm like the guy who came from the future. I'm like Lincoln Steffens. I've been to the future and it doesn't work. This is your future now. Maybe they'll listen. We'll talk about it when I get back.
okay, so we only have a minute or so left. That's the book.
Baron Metal, go to culturewars.com and begin your liberation from the debt society, the debt slavery that the society is creating for you. culturewars.com.
Okay. Your article, it's about a 40-page article on both of those trips. Tonight, I think we're going to focus a little bit more on your talk in Berlin.
Yeah.
Okay.
But they're related. I mean, basically, we're talking about the same zeitgeist here, I think, throughout the world now. Dissatisfaction with oligarchic rule. The oligarchs have reached the end of their tether. I arrived and spoke in London 2 days after the Brexit vote. And the people that I was speaking to were basically celebrating the leaving of the European Union. That's a protest against the oligarchs. That's the way the English are protesting the oligarchs. And Germany is a completely different situation. Completely the other side of the whole story there, the center of the European Union, they're the people that control the European Union, but there's a different kind of protest going on there as well.
Is there you know, traditionally they had two wars. World War I, English against the Germans. World War II. Is there a dynamic? I mean, they're at the core of the EU and Britain's getting out?
No, well, I mean, if you go back to World War I was about who's going to rule the world. And that was very simple. Over the course of the 19th century, Germany had had united for the first time really in history. All the German principalities had united. They had created a tariff, an external tariff against cheap English manufacturers. At this point, they started paying decent wages. The Bismarck, listening to Bishop von Kettler, instituted Social Security and health insurance. At this point, the German workers stopped emigrating to places like America. The reason I'm here.
Where we came over.
Half the reason I'm here anyway was the German half. When they concentrated German labor, German productivity just took off. And by 1910, Germany had surpassed England in every single category of industrial production. So that was bad enough, but in addition to that, the Kaiser, having dismissed Bismarck as the best advisor, started challenging Britannia's rule of the waves by building battleships. That was a fatal mistake. When he did that, Churchill and Lord Grey decided that they were going to lure Germany into a war to destroy the German alternative to English capitalism. And that's what World War I was about, and World War II was just the sequel to finish off the job. So it was a Pyrrhic victory for England. England destroyed itself in the process of trying to destroy Germany. That was the end, and that was the rise of the American Empire in its place, the sea power that was going to replace Britannia's rule of the waves. And at that point, Germany became a colony of the United States, conquered, subjected to ruthless forms of social engineering. So that's sort of the context. There's Germany is awakening to the fact that they were subjected to social engineering. And they're starting to understand the ramifications of that. And Berlin is, when it comes to social engineering, Berlin is ground zero. That was a unique situation. It was kind of the laboratory where you tried out the experiments on the German guinea pigs. And if it worked in Berlin, then you would use it in the rest of Germany, you use it elsewhere.
People don't know, but I majored in German at Notre Dame. And I spent a year in
What I think is a counterproductive way of, get white racism as the antidote to anti-white racism. But it's not that dissimilar from Indiana, in the sense that both countries, both places were subjected to basically looting in the late 70s, early 80s, when the leveraged buyout kings like Jimmy Goldsmith would loot British industrial infrastructure, cut it up, sell it off. The worker gets kicked out, and I mean, England has never been friendly to the worker. England has always been a place that exploited labor.
Well, that was the whole Charles Dickens, right?
Absolutely. The 19th century has literature, all sorts of literature about the exploitation of labor. Engels wrote a book about the working class, the parlous condition of the working class in England in the middle of the 19th century. He linked up with Karl Marx. Karl Marx was living in London at the time, working at the library there. And also, I mean, Heinrich Besch, the German Jesuit, when he got kicked out of Germany because of the Kulturkampf, he went to England. Everybody knows that the English were notorious for exploiting labor, because it's a tradition there, all the way up to Margaret Thatcher and the coal miners, the brutal way she dealt with them. So these are the people who have been abused by their own system, and now, but they don't have they really don't have an alternative.
But the World War I, if you could put it on another level, there was an argument. Germany was saying, we're better. Our system is better.
No, they were better. There's no question.
Right.
All of the facts were on Germany's side. They simply outproduced England because they understood better than the English that labor is the source of all value. And German labor is the biggest asset Germany has. They have virtually no natural resource. They got coal and iron in the Ruhr. They have no gas, no oil. They have to import all this type of stuff. But they have they have German labor, which is high quality.
But why is there a difference? I mean, the way they structure themselves, their theory behind, their philosophy. Why is there a difference? It can't be because they're genetically.
No, it's not biological, it's cultural. Basically, it goes all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire, which was the successor of the Roman Empire. And what was that? It was all of these principalities in the middle of Europe that suddenly were operating according to a new principle that valued labor. And that was the motto of the Benedictines, which is basically ora et labora. No one in the history of the human race had ever taken labor seriously. The Greeks, much as I admire the Greeks, felt that manual labor was something that slaves did so that people like Aristotle and Plato could be philosophers. Benedict changed all that with the monasteries and made work an integral part of the life of the monks there.
And then Germany internalized.
Germany internalized. I was there. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I rode down the Danube. And if you row down the Danube, you see all of these Benedictine monasteries. And they're all surrounded by orchards and vineyards. It was the Benedictines who brought grapes and fruit to the Red Danube Valley. And they taught the Germans how to work. Because Germany, the original Germans, they loved chasing pigs through the forest. That's about all they could do. And they'd still be chasing pigs through the forest if it weren't for the Benedictines who brought grapes. I said this to I was invited to speak to the Amish. My friend Malin Miller invited me to speak to the Amish children that he teaches. And I said to them, I said that there was a Roman senator who said that when he went to the Danube, he said, these are the saddest people on the face of the earth because they don't have grapes and they don't have olives. And, well, they still don't have olives. You still can't grow olives there, but you can grow grapes there. And he said, because the grapes, you make wine. And then I said to the Amish kids, I said, and wine makes you happy. And at this point, they all turned around and looked, is this true? And if so, why aren't we drinking it? Don't we want to be happy? But I said to them, I said, if it weren't for the Benedictines, you'd still be chasing pigs through the forest. Because that's all the Germans knew how to do until they were civilized. So you had this concentration of German labor. The guild system. This was a creation of the Holy Roman Empire, which really wasn't a state. It wasn't a state until 1871. But it was basically all of these German people with habits, work habits, which were the best in the world, I'd have to say. And that is created this German labor that now produces things like BMWs and Mercedes. You know, I've seen the German workers. I've seen the BMW plant in Munich. I mean, it's really sophisticated. So I have a son who works at Ford, and the big question is, why is Volkswagen making $9 billion in profits and Ford is only making $3 billion in profits? Well, the answer is German labor. It's the biggest resource in any country. And they have treated it well, so therefore, and the English have not.
Well, in the concentration camps, it said Arbeit macht frei.
Arbeit macht frei.
So obviously they even had internalized.
Some people say they were there to work. It would seem to indicate that that's what the slogan was there.
Arbeit means work, right?
Yeah.
But that shows you that the Germans really admired.
They do, and they have work habits that are the best in the world. I mean, you know, I don't want to make invidious comparisons, but different than the Italians, let's say, the Italian work habits.
Agreed.
And any place in the world. I mean, basically, you have some places in the world where the idea of work is not really all that well known. You know, where basically, if you're a hunter-gatherer, what's work? Basically, you know, when you're hungry, you go out and kill something. And then the rest of the time you just lie around and wait to get hungry again.
So this is the background, part of the background. So when you're talking Berlin, it was partly on economics. I mean, this what we're talking about related to
it was basically about the destruction of the left. How did that happen? They had no idea about this. The Germans, they're waking up to the fact that they don't really know their own history. They've been sold a bill of goods. Now, there are people, like Horst Mahler was the lawyer for the Baader-Meinhof gang. Horst Mahler was a left communist during the 70s. Now he's the opposite extreme, right-wing German nationalist. Going to jail, began a lecture with Spiegel by saying Heil Hitler, which will get you thrown in jail in Germany. Can't do that. But he insists on doing it. He's become a kind of martyr to the German people. Okay? But he still, he understands that something happened, but I don't think he understands what really happened. No one has done the research over there. And so this is my second time in Berlin. I was there 41 years
75.
ago. 75 I was there. Needless to say, it was a different place in 75. This organization exists. But so what happened is this disillusionment started to spread. And the expression of it was this thing called the Tunics Conference in Berlin, January 78. Foucault shows up at the Tunics means two nicks. Don't do anything.
Yeah.
Do nothing.
To it.
And it sounded sort of like Tunis. And so there was kind of puns on this type of thing. But basically, it was at this point the left disintegrated into a lot of different component parts. The guy that I stayed with was a student, a theology student at the university in Berlin. He had been fed Bultmann's demythologizing line and realized...
Udo, who I saw.
Anyway, you saw him. He had been fed this line. He realized he couldn't believe anything. There was nothing he could believe in, and so he left, and he went off to Pune to sit at the feet of the Bhagwan. and get enlightenment from the Indians. You know, it's always a bad sign when Germans go to India. It's always a bad sign because what it means is they are basically completely disillusioned with life, and they have this kind of nihilistic death wish, which is what India symbolized. Hegel talked about it a lot. India is a land with no logos, where everyone ends up on opium in one way or another. And that's where he ended up. And that was one manifestation of the collapse of the left at this point. And this is the disintegration of basically the revolutionary movement that had existed for 200 years. If you say from 1776 to 1977, that's 201 years. Complete disillusionment.
They saw, and you could say they saw it first.
And there, it was tried out first. So Berlin has always been, as I said, the laboratory for social engineering. And here it is, this disillusionment is spreading throughout the place. And so what happens at this point is, you know, the wall comes down in '89, and now Berlin, Germany, is reunified, and now Berlin is the capital of the Foucauldian Empire.
You're going to find utopia in sex.
In sex, and it's not even sex. I mean, I kept looking for the sex. It's not there. Where is it? Where is the sex? It's like Amsterdam. You walk out of the train station, and the red light district is right across the street. And you're wandering there, and the Dutch are avid to steal your money with changing your dollars, and then you walk in there, and the whores are ready to take your money. And it's all right out there in the open, because it's a port city. Hamburg's the same way. Berlin, there's no red light district. And so there's a sense in which it's all homosexual, which maybe it's me, I'm not, that's not my persuasion, but it's not public in the way that the red light districts in other places are. So it's kind of like an interesting experience. So I'm there. Our last program was on the
oligarchs?
No, it was on the gay disco.
Gay disco.
It was
Right,
on Orlando. So I'm there like a week or two after Orlando. And the rainbow flags are flying all over the place. And so after I give my talk, my buddy and I are riding bicycles around Berlin, because now this is the way you get around Berlin. Berlin looks like Amsterdam in terms of the bicycles.
They push the bicycle.
And so suddenly I'm realizing, wait a minute, there's a pattern here. There's a pattern here. It's homosexuals and bicycles. That's the new world order. And Berlin is the headquarters. And guess what? Berlin has a gay mayor. The first gay mayor in Europe. Okay, openly gay mayor. And guess what? He's saying the same thing that Pete Buttigieg is saying in South Bend. A little bit different, but his slogan, famous slogan, his name is Klaus Wowereit, and his famous slogan is, "Wir sind arm, aber sexy." We're poor, but we're sexy. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean?
It means we're having fun.
Yes.
We're having fun, so now that's all that counts.
That's right, and what it really means is you're getting crap wages, which is exactly what Pete Buttigieg said in the New York Times. Remember we were talking about this the last time. Pete is anointed by the oligarchs as the first gay president.
Let us down.
And so what is his job here? His job here is to take over South Bend, the Catholic, ethnic, industrial, post-industrial powerhouse of the Midwest, isolationism, the whole thing. This is the challenge, and now it's going to be transformed into the gay disco. America is a gay disco. Frank Bruni says this after the Orlando shooting. Berlin is already a gay disco.
So not only are they going to get us to accept sodomy, they're going to get us to promote it.
It's sodomy and low wages. Visit arm, aber sexy. That's exactly Pete's message. Pete's message in the New York Times is those good jobs are never coming back. So go to the gay disco. Go to the gay disco.
So you're just saying basically it's the oligarchs that are pushing both.
Of course it is. This is the oligarchs' triumph over the people. And so what you have, so the big, obviously, in 41 years, Berlin has changed enormously. I mean, there was a wall there. I went through Checkpoint Charlie to get to the East Berlin. It was like right out of a John Le Carré novel back then. You know, Bridge of Spies. I was there where they did the filming of Bridge of Spies, which is basically Spielberg's latest take on Berlin, and so on and so forth. So we're riding around by bicycle, which is
You loved it.
I'm a devoted bicycle guy, so I got it half right. I got this bicycle part right. The homosexual part is not right. Anyway, we're riding around Berlin and all this new architecture, because as of '89, it became the architect's paradise.
Right.
So we get to, like, Potsdamer Platz is the Sony headquarters. This is where they have the Berlin Film Festival, and the symbol of Berlin is the bear. So it's all this daring architecture to show that Berlin is this is the new Berlin, that Berlin is the capital now of Europe, the European Union, and it basically is the gay disco. So we get to the new embassies. The new American embassy is built. Go up to the new American embassy, and there's a statue. Okay, it's the bear, which is the symbol of Berlin, combined with the Statue of Liberty. So the bear is holding the torch, got the crown around his head in the book. And guess what's draped over the bear's shoulder? The gay flag, the gay rainbow flag. Now this is an official statement of the government of the United States of America, officially coming out in support of the gay disco. This is the new world order.
It's all in the name of liberty, right? What's it in the name of?
Sure it is, liberty. Remember, give me your oppressed.
Right,
It's called the Statue of Liberty, isn't it?
So that's what John Wesley said. He said they're using this word liberty to be free from God's law. I mean,
That's right. That is the essence of what America stands for right now. America is a gay disco.
not freedom for Christ, and I'm free to be able to obey the Ten Commandments. I'm free from them.
Right. Which is another word for slavery, of course.
Of course, right. So they're turning it.
Give me that man who is not passion's slave. Well, Shakespeare knew that because he knew the Western tradition, which goes all the way back to St. Augustine, who said, a man has as many masters as he has vices. You cannot be liberated from the moral law. The moral law is liberation. We are rational creatures. We are only free to be rational. The moral law is practical reason. That's the only way we can exercise our freedom, is by acting according to the moral law. So the people who liberate you from the moral law are really enslaving you. Now this is news to Berlin. Berlin figured this out yet.
But haven't they understood the Enlightenment? I mean, the Enlightenment basically says that you're born good, and
Berlin is one of the capitals. I would say it is the capital of the Enlightenment. You can't go anywhere without seeing pictures of statues of Frederick the Great. He's all over the place. This was the city he created.
well, wouldn't you say the fundamental idea of Enlightenment is that the human being is born good?
Well, that's certainly what Rousseau said.
Yeah. And if you believe that when you have a child, you and your wife get together and go, I don't think our child's born good. I think we're going to have to watch him. I think we're going to have
The
to.
Enlightenment was the reaction to Calvinism.
Right.
And Calvinism said,
Total depravity.
total depravity.
Right.
In other words, it's, don't have a chance. And we went through this with Nathaniel Hawthorne in the 19th century in America. America's always a kind of backwater when it comes to ideas. And the Germans went through it in the 18th century with the Enlightenment, the end of the 18th century. Paris and Berlin were basically the capitals of the Enlightenment. You know, there's no way to get around it.
Well, your position is the Catholic Church has always been successful at maintaining avoidance of those two extremes, right? I mean, that's, if you study their doctrine, it's like you stay on course.
Yeah, I mean, if you get back to original sin, we're wounded. It's a crisis at this point, a crisis in the left. The French left, the gauche proletarian, had already decided we're not getting into terrorism. At that point, the leadership of the revolutionary movement shifted to the Baader-Meinhof gang, and now the Baader-Meinhof, they're both dead. And basically the question is does this organization exist? But so what happened is, this disillusionment started to spread. And the expression of it was this thing called the Tunics Conference in Berlin, January 78. Foucault shows up at the Tunics means two nicks. Don't do anything. Do nothing.
To it.
And it sounded sort of like Tunis. And so there were kind of puns on this type of thing. But basically, it was at this point the left disintegrated into a lot of different component parts. The guy that I stayed with was a student, a theology student at the university in Berlin. He had been fed Bultmann's demythologizing line and realized...
Udo, who I saw.
Anyway, you saw him. He had been fed this line. He realized he couldn't believe anything. There was nothing he could believe in, and so he left and he went off to Pune to sit at the feet of the Bhagwan and get enlightenment from the Indians. You know, it's always a bad sign when Germans go to India. It's always a bad sign because what it means is they are basically completely disillusioned with life, and they have this kind of nihilistic death wish, which is what India symbolized. Hegel talked about it a lot. India is a land with no logos, where everyone ends up on opium in one way or another. And that's where he ended up. And that was one manifestation of the collapse of the left at this point. And this is the disintegration of basically the revolutionary movement that had existed for 200 years. If you say from 1776 to 1977, that's 201 years. Complete disillusionment.
They saw, and you could say they saw it first.
And that it was tried out first. So Berlin has always been, as I said, the laboratory for social engineering. And here it is, this disillusionment is spreading throughout the place. And so what happens at this point is, you know, the wall comes down in '89, and now Berlin, Germany is reunified, and now Berlin is the capital of the Foucauldian Empire.
Or what the lower can do for itself. And so you had one food company in Tanzania, which allowed the creation of a nomenclatura, a corrupt ruling class elite that basically used it as a form of extorting bribes from people. What do you expect? And of course, that led to an unsustainable system. And at that point, the repressed returns. Robert McNamara leaves the World Bank. The new guy comes in and imposes the orthodoxy of Milton Friedman on the rest of the world. And they cut off the aid, and now they're just predatory lending, and the result is privatization, and Tanzania goes into international debt. That was true for the entire world. So you see the basic cycle. Nyerere became a socialist because socialism was the orthodoxy in England at that time. That was because of John Maynard Keynes, who had to pick up the pieces after capitalism collapsed in 1929. It failed. It failed. It always fails because capitalism is state-sponsored usury. And usury always leads to unrepayable debt and collapses the economy. Always happens. That's basically the story of my book. Okay? So now that's, that would be going too far.
Okay.
The reinjection of morality came with Bishop von Kettler.
Okay.
His book, Das Christentum und die Arbeiterfrage, came out in the same year as Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Okay? And it was at this point, Pesch seized the really tremendously deleterious effect that capitalism is having on the German worker, because these are the people in Mainz who are his parishioners. These are his flock. And they're being ground into dust because of one simple thing called the iron law of wages, which is basically you can treat labor like any other commodity and just drive the price down until the point which they reached in Germany, where the standard wage was not enough to sustain a working man, and most principally a working man as the father and head of a family. This is precisely what happened in Florence under the Medicis. They drove the wages down to the point where the working man could not support a family. When this happens, that's the end of the workforce, because guess what? If you can't have children, there's no future. And if there's no future, there are no workers. And so by by the beginning of the 16th century, Florence was the museum that it is today. It stopped being the economic powerhouse that it was in the 15th century. It became the museum it is today because they basically destroyed their own workforce. And they got into banking, they got out of cloth manufacturing, they got into banking, and that's the story of every single country that has gone down this road since that time. Holland, England, America. That's when you were reading that C.D. Jackson passage about America selling washing machines. I found myself thinking, this feeling of nostalgia came over, and you diverted it into non-productive uses of money, and the result was basically they felt the economy got out of control, too much debt, inflation, and that allowed the entrance of the villains like Paul Volcker, who created a hugely predatory system of the leverage buyout and cheap money to basically gut the great industrial powerhouse of the United States for short-term gains.
And this is just when they're, of course, the trial idlers are sitting.
Mi más psicotrópico saludo. Esto ha sido Enigma 5 para todos vosotros. Hasta pronto.